As discussed previously, these electron distribution diagrams are convenient models that help us keep track of the valence electrons and therefore predict the reactivity of different atoms. Please keep in mind that these pictures do not accurately represent the shape of an atom or the actual location of the electrons. These are just models to help us understand what is happening. I want you to pay special attention to hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. Hydrogen has an atomic number of 1. That means that there is 1 proton in the nucleus, and therefore there must be 1 electron outside of the atomic nucleus to balance that charge if we have a neutral hydrogen atom. Unpaired electrons are reactive, so this particular hydrogen atom would be unstable as is. Taking a look at carbon, carbon has an atomic number of 6, so if that carbon atom is neutral, it must also have 6 electrons to balance the 6 protons in the atomic nucleus. As you're adding electrons to these diagrams, you always start with the lowest level, the lowest energy level electron shell, and fill that orbital with 2 electrons, and then go out to the next electron shell and start placing 1 electron into each of the 4 orbitals there until you start pairing up. In the case of carbon, we have 4 unpaired electrons in this outer shell, or 4 valence electrons, and therefore carbon is likely to form 4 bonds to become stable. Nitrogen has 5 electrons in its valence shell, 5 valence electrons. 2 of them are paired, but 3 are unpaired, so nitrogen is typically going to form 3 bonds. Oxygen has 6 electrons in its outermost shell, 6 valence electrons. These 2 are paired and stable. These 2 are paired and stable. However, the other 2 are not paired, they're unstable, and oxygen is likely to form 2 bonds. Notice the 3 atoms on the right side of your screen. These atoms are inert, or chemically unreactive, and the reason is because their valence electrons all exist in pairs. There are no unpaired electrons in the valence shell, and therefore these atoms are stable on their own. They do not form bonds with other atoms. The formation and function of molecules depends on how chemical bonds occur between the atoms that make up the molecules. As mentioned before, atoms with incomplete valence shells can share or transfer valence electrons with certain other atoms in order to gain stability, so that all of the valence electrons are paired, not singular in each orbital. The interactions between an atom's electrons and another atom usually result in atoms staying close together, held by attractions that we call chemical bonds. A few definitions on this slide. A molecule is a group of atoms held together by energy in the form of a covalent bond. So, if we have 2 or more atoms, that says greater than or equal to 2 atoms that are joined together by a covalent bond, then we have a molecule. A compound is a group of atoms, again, 2 or more atoms, of different elements that are held together by some sort of bond. So a molecule may or may not be a compound. If a molecule is composed of at least 2 different types of elements, we can say it is also a compound. But not all molecules are composed of 2 or more different elements. For example, oxygen gas, which consists of 2 oxygen atoms joined together, has 1 type of element. Therefore, it's not a compound. However, water, which has 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, has 2 different elements and is therefore a compound. So we can say that water meets the criteria for both a molecule and a compound. Regardless of if you're talking about a molecule or a compound or both, the energy holding the two atoms together is called a chemical bond, and there are four principal types of chemical bonds. Covalent bonds are the strongest of the bonds, and they occur when two atoms share electrons so that their valence orbitals are all complete, two electrons in every orbital. When two atoms are forming a covalent bond with one another, we have a molecule. Ionic bonds, hydrogen bonds, and van der Waals interactions are not as strong as covalent bonds. However, they are still very important in biology. Ionic bonds occur between atoms that have charges. An ionic bond occurs between a positively charged atom called a cation and a negatively charged atom called an anion. This is a relatively strong attraction between opposite charges and results in what's called an ionic compound. Ionic bonds are also very important when it comes to holding together a functional three-dimensional shape of a large molecule. So part of a large molecule might form an ionic bond with another part of the molecule, giving it a certain shape. Ionic bonds are also important for bonding between molecules. Hydrogen bonds are very important in many biological molecules. We'll look at some examples of that in the structure of DNA. Hydrogen bonds are an attraction between partial opposite charges, a partial positive and a partial negative. The partial positive will be located in the region of a hydrogen atom, and the partial negative will be a different atom such as oxygen or nitrogen. Individually, hydrogen bonds are very weak. However, when there are many hydrogen bonds together, they are cumulatively strong, sort of like Velcro. Hydrogen bonds, like ionic bonds, are also very important in forming the functional three-dimensional shape of many molecules and bonding between molecules. Van der Waals interactions are due to the random movement of electrons at all times. So as electrons are moving around, they cause partial negative areas in a molecule and partial positive areas in the molecule, which are always shifting and changing. Molecules must be very close together to interact by these weak van der Waals interactions. A covalent bond, as mentioned previously, is the sharing of a pair of valence electrons by two atoms. In a covalent bond, the shared electrons count as part of each atom's valence shell. Let's consider, for example, a molecule of water. Water consists of two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom joined by covalent bonds. We'll start with the oxygen atom in the center, and then we'll see how that oxygen atom is going to form a covalent bond with one hydrogen atom and another covalent bond with the other hydrogen atom. And then there will be four electrons that don't participate in any bonds in that valence shell of the oxygen atom. This illustration shows two lines. Each of those represents a covalent bond. So one molecule of water has two covalent bonds where electrons are shared. Considering first the oxygen atom. If you look at the periodic table, you will see that oxygen has an atomic number of 8. So there are 8 protons in the atomic nucleus of that oxygen atom. And most oxygen atoms also have 8 neutrons in that nucleus. If we have a neutral oxygen atom, we need 8 electrons. In the first electron shell, we will find one orbital that has 2 electrons in it. And then as we go out to the next electron shell, we're going to add the other electrons. So remember, we need 8 total. We have 2 here in the first shell and the first orbital. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And every electron has a negative charge. So now our electrons and protons are balanced. We have a neutral oxygen atom. But the electrons below in my illustration are unpaired in their orbitals and therefore unstable. Put a hydrogen atom into the mix. A hydrogen atom has an atomic number of 1, so there's just one proton in the nucleus. And most hydrogen atoms don't have neutrons either, so their whole nucleus is simply one proton. They need to have one electron in that first shell to balance the positive charge of the proton. And we can see that when we put an oxygen atom and a hydrogen atom in close proximity, these valence electrons can overlap and be shared between the two atoms to form a covalent bond. If we put another hydrogen atom on the other side with its proton and its electron, again, these electrons can be shared, forming another covalent bond. So these shared electrons result in full orbitals for each of the atoms, stability, and we have produced a molecule, which consists of 3 atoms in this case, held together by 2 covalent bonds. As you look at drawings of molecules throughout this quarter, pay attention to solid lines that are drawn between atoms. Those always represent a covalent bond, where each line has 2 electrons represented, 2 electrons that are being shared. In this figure, we're looking at 4 small molecules. As we go from the left to the right, we see the name of the molecule and the molecular formula. In other words, what atoms come together to form this molecule. We then can look at electron distribution diagrams, and these are similar to the drawing I did on the previous page, where you can see the valence electrons that are shared in the covalent bond between the atoms. A Lewis dot structure focuses on the shared electrons. The structural formula is what you'll see mostly in this class, where we can draw solid lines to represent each covalent bond. And then the space-filling model is a more realistic representation of the actual 3-dimensional shape of each of these molecules. As you look through these examples, note the difference between the structural formula and the molecular formula. The structural formula is always going to show you solid lines between atoms to represent covalent bonds, and you'll get an idea of how each of those atoms are related to one another in the molecule. So here's a structural formula that I'm circling for each of these small molecules. If you look at methane, answer this question. How many covalent bonds are found in one molecule of methane? Simply look at the structural formula and count the solid lines. You will see 4 lines and therefore 4 covalent bonds. The molecular formula is more of a shorthand formula. You don't see where the bonds occur, you just see how many atoms are in a single molecule. So there are 2 hydrogen atoms in hydrogen gas, as shown in this molecular formula. If there is only one of an atom, such as the case in water, we don't put a 1 subscript, it is simply inferred. It's only if there are 2 or more atoms in the molecule that you see that numerical subscript in the molecular formula. Let's take a moment and consider a very small molecule, oxygen gas. The molecular formula for oxygen gas is O2. That is the molecular formula. So for one molecule of oxygen gas, how many atoms are there? Well, 2 oxygen atoms. The structural formula for oxygen gas looks a little different. It shows you how those 2 oxygen atoms are joined together. So we have 2 oxygen atoms with two covalent bonds between them. And then there are some electrons that are also represented here as dots. The structural formula gives you an idea of the actual shape of the molecule and how the atoms are joined together. Let's draw this in a little more detail. When you look at the periodic table, you see that every oxygen atom has 8 protons in its nucleus, and most oxygen atoms also have 8 neutrons. The atomic mass of oxygen is 16. A neutral oxygen atom will also have 8 electrons. So in the first electron shell, we have 1, 2. Second electron shell, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 electrons total. There's one neutral oxygen atom, and notice it has 2, 4, 5, 6 valence electrons, 2 of which are unstable because they're unpaired. We'll draw one more oxygen atom with 8 protons, 8 neutrons in the atomic nucleus, 2 electrons in the first electron shell orbital, and the remaining electrons are in the 4 orbitals that are found in the second electron shell. Once again, we have 6 valence electrons, and once again, 2 that are unpaired and unstable. So when 2 neutral oxygen atoms come together like this, we can have a covalent bond form here, where the shared electrons complete the orbitals for each atom and thus provide stability, and another covalent bond here. Covalent bonds, as you have seen, share electrons between atoms. If the electrons are shared equally between the atoms participating in the covalent bond, we call that bond nonpolar. However, if the electrons are not shared equally, in other words, if one atom is more electronegative or electron hoarding, if you will, has a greater affinity for electrons, then they will be located more closely to that electronegative atom, and therefore they're not really shared equally between the atoms. In this case, we get these partial positive and partial negative ends in a molecule, where the electronegative atoms have the partial negative because they're hoarding the electrons. The less electronegative, the non-electronegative atoms have a partial positive. So, unequal sharing of electrons causes partial positive and partial negative charges for each atom or molecule when we have polar covalent bonds. Think of the poles of the Earth. Here we've got the poles of a molecule with partial charges due to an unequal sharing of electrons. Shown to the right is a molecule of water, H2O. So H2O is the molecular formula, and then drawn above it is a space-filling model that shows you the structure of the molecule. It's sort of like an upside-down V. This molecule is polar because it consists of 2 polar covalent bonds. The oxygen atom is very electronegative, and therefore the shared electrons spend more time in its vicinity, giving this end of the molecule a partial negative charge, which we represent with the delta negative. It's a partial negative. The opposite end of the molecule, where the hydrogen atoms are, doesn't get as many electrons, and so this end of the molecule is partially positive. So we have 2 poles to this molecule due to the polar bonds. In general, a molecule that is built from nonpolar covalent bonds is what we call hydrophobic. Hydro for water and phobic for fearing. Hydrophobic molecules do not interact with water. They repel it. Consider oil, for example. If you put olive oil into a jar of water, it does not dissolve. Rather, it beads up on itself because of its nonpolar covalent bonds and its hydrophobic nature. Lipids are hydrophobic because of the type of bonds holding the atoms together. Molecules that are built from polar covalent bonds, where electrons are not shared equally, where electrons are not distributed equally across the molecule, are what we call hydrophilic molecules, or water-loving, or affinity for water. Please remember this prefix hydro in reference to water, and the suffix philic in reference to an attraction to or an affinity. Hydrophilic molecules are attracted to water and will interact with it or can be dissolved in it. Note that the water molecule discussed previously and shown on the right side of the screen is a polar molecule itself. So polar molecules interact with other polar molecules, or we could say hydrophilic molecules interact with other hydrophilic molecules. The second type of bond that I want to talk about is called an ionic bond. Before an ionic bond can occur, atoms must either gain or lose electrons and therefore acquire a charge, an electrical charge. When two atoms come close together, sometimes one will strip an electron from another. A classic example of that is seen with the two atoms sodium, abbreviated Na, and chlorine, abbreviated Cl. We're going to zip to the next slide and look at that electron transfer first, and then we'll come back to this slide. Focus in on the left side of the screen for now, where you see a neutral sodium atom and a neutral chlorine atom. If you look up sodium on the periodic table, you will see that it has an atomic number of 11. So there are 11 protons in the nucleus of a sodium atom, and usually 11 neutrons as well. Since I said this atom is neutral, we should also count 11 electrons. Let's do that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 electrons as well. So we have 11 protons, we have 11 electrons, each with a negative charge. I'll put a P here for proton. 11 protons with a positive, 11 electrons with a negative for a neutral sodium. Notice that the valence electron here is all by itself in its orbital, which is unstable. Pure sodium is found as a metal in nature. This is a metal. Chlorine, on the other side, has an atomic number of 17. So there are 17 positively charged protons in the nucleus of every chlorine atom, and because this one is neutral, we must have 17 electrons that are negative to balance that charge. Let's count them. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, and then 17. There's one electron that is unpaired in this particular orbital in the valence shell. So chlorine, in its pure form, as shown here, is typically a very toxic gas. If a sodium atom and a chlorine atom are in each other's vicinity, the chlorine atom will steal an electron from the sodium atom. And the result is that each atom now has orbitals that are full. Each orbital has 2 electrons, and we have 2 very stable atoms. What has also resulted is that these atoms have gained charges. Consider the sodium atom. The sodium atom lost an electron, so now it has 11 protons and only 10 electrons. There is 1 extra proton compared to electrons, therefore we have 1 positive charge. The chlorine atom gained an electron, so this chlorine atom now has 17 protons and 18 electrons. It has an extra electron and therefore it has a negative charge. Atoms that have charges are called ions. And ions can interact with each other through these fairly strong bonding interactions that we call ionic bonds. Going back to the previous slide for a moment, you just saw that after the transfer of an electron from sodium to chlorine, both atoms have a charge. A charged atom, or a molecule for that matter, can be referred to as an ion. Ionic bonds will form between ions of opposite charges, so between positive and negative charges. An ion is a general term. We can be more specific and say a cation is an ion with a positive charge. Cations have lost electrons, so they have more protons than electrons. Anions have gained electrons and therefore are negatively charged. Ionic bonds are attractions between anions and cations, between the negatively charged ions and the positively charged ions. These are fairly strong interactions, fairly strong bonds that are generalized. The result is that compounds are formed. When we put sodium and chlorine next to each other, we get a compound called salt, table salt, also known as sodium chloride. This is a compound because it is formed from two different types of elements. We're not calling it a molecule because there is no covalent bonds involved and there's not a specific number of atoms involved. A compound like sodium chloride will exist as a crystal that can have any number of atoms. The formula that we use to represent this compound is simply giving you a ratio. So for every sodium atom, you're going to have a chlorine atom, but the numbers can vary. Unlike molecules, which always have a very specific number of very specific atoms. Recall that pure sodium is a metal and pure chlorine is a toxic gas. However, when they come together with ionic bonding, we get a compound, table salt, that we can now put in our mouths. We can swallow it and it doesn't kill us. Consider the properties of table salt. We have a solid crystal that we can now consume without dying. This is an example of an emergent property. Sodium by itself is a metal, chlorine by itself is a toxic gas, but together they form a crystal solid that is non-toxic and makes our food taste better. The third type of bonding I want to discuss is the hydrogen bond. A hydrogen bond, as mentioned previously, is fairly weak individually, but when you have many of them together, perhaps millions of hydrogen bonds like you'd see in a DNA molecule, they are cumulatively quite strong, similar to Velcro. An individual hook in Velcro is very weak, but a thick strip of Velcro is very difficult to pull apart because of the cumulative strength. A hydrogen bond forms when a hydrogen atom that is already covalently bonded to some other atom, some electron hoarding atom, and therefore has a partial positive charge on it, is also attracted to a different electronegative atom that has a partial negative charge on it. In cells, we see this typically happening between hydrogen and oxygen or hydrogen and nitrogen. Before we look at a hydrogen bond in some more detail, let's consider a single water molecule. You've already seen this. You're looking at the structural formula. We could draw the structural formula a little more simply with our oxygen and two covalent bonds, two hydrogens. So there's our structural formula of water. Remember, oxygen is very electronegative or electron hoarding. So these shared electrons spend more of their time in the vicinity of the oxygen atom than the hydrogen atoms. And that gives this end of the molecule a partial negative charge. The hydrogens have a partial positive charge because they don't have as many electrons around them at any given time. So we've got a polar molecule here. Polar molecules can form hydrogen bonds with other polar molecules, as you will see on the next slide. Shown at the top is water. Here's the molecular formula, and then here's a space-filling model that gives you a better look at the structural formula, like a V. The oxygen end has a partial negative charge. The hydrogen end has a partial positive charge. Down below, we have a different molecule, ammonia, which consists of one nitrogen atom and 3 covalent bonds to 3 hydrogen atoms. Nitrogen is very electronegative, and it will hoard these shared electrons so that more of them are on this end of our molecule than at this end. So the nitrogen end has a partial negative, whereas the hydrogen end has a partial positive. This is another polar molecule. So water with this partial positive end will form a hydrogen bond with the partial negative end of this ammonia molecule. Hydrogen bonds are always noted with dotted lines. So if you ever see an illustration with dotted lines between atoms, you know you're looking at a hydrogen bond. Water can also form hydrogen bonds with other water molecules. In liquid water, the water molecules are constantly forming and breaking hydrogen bonds. Recall that the partial negative side of the water molecule is the end where the oxygen is located. In green, I've shown electrons that are paired but not participating in bonds. And the other end of the molecule, where the hydrogens are, is partially positive. Hydrogen bonds form between the partial positive end of one water molecule and the partial negative end of another. Hydrogen bonds are always drawn with dotted lines, as I'm doing here. And notice that the water molecule in the middle has formed 4 hydrogen bonds with its neighboring water molecules. The way in which atoms come together through chemical bonding will determine a molecule's three-dimensional shape, which is vital to its function, its role in a cell. As you've seen, the 3D structure of a molecule is determined by the position of the valence orbitals, the regions of the outermost electron shell that are most likely to contain electrons. Biological molecules recognize and interact with each other with a specificity based on molecular shape. The specificity of molecular interaction requires complementary shapes between molecules. Like a hand fitting into a glove, the two shapes must be complementary for the two structures to come together as they should. Molecules that have similar shapes can have similar biological effects because of this concept of complementary shapes leading to interactions between molecules. An example of that is illustrated here, where we consider natural endorphin and morphine. Morphine is an opiate drug. It is a narcotic alkaloid formed naturally by the opium poppy plant. Opioid drugs are semi-synthetics that are derived from opiates, such as hydrocodone and oxycodone. All of the opioid drugs, including morphine, have an effect of alleviating pain and altering the mood, often giving feelings of euphoria. In our bodies, our pituitary gland makes a molecule called endorphin, shown on the left. Endorphin is a signaling molecule, as I said, made by the pituitary gland. The way that it works in our brains is that it binds to receptors on the surface of brain cells and results in pain relief and again feelings of euphoria, especially during times of stress. Down below, you're looking at a slice through a brain cell. So if you consider the brain cell is a three-dimensional form, but we've taken a slice right through it so that we can see what's happening in this region of the cell membrane. In the cell membrane, there are what we call receptors. So these are proteins embedded in the membrane that protrude from the surface of the cell. And these receptors are molecules that have a very specific three-dimensional shape that will bind to only a very specific complementary three-dimensional shape. Endorphin receptors in our brain cells bind to the natural endorphin molecule produced by our pituitary gland and result in the pain relief and the good feelings. If you look at this more detailed structure above, pay attention to this area that I'm highlighting with a rectangle, that space-filling model. That region of endorphin is the complementary shape that allows it to bind to the receptors in the brain cell. Morphine, although a very different molecule if you look at the whole thing, has a region that looks very similar to our endorphin. So morphine, because of this similar three-dimensional shape, is able to bind to the same endorphin receptors on our brain cells and cause those biological effects discussed. This is a close match in shape between two different molecules that allows them both to bind to these brain cell receptors. To conclude this chapter, we're going to briefly mention chemical reactions. Chemical reactions are responsible for joining atoms together to build the molecules we've been discussing. And also, chemical reactions are responsible for breaking down molecules or breaking chemical bonds. So chemical reactions in general are the making and breaking of bonds between atoms. When considering an entire chemical reaction, the molecule or molecules that you start with are referred to as the substrates, or sometimes the reactants. There might be one substrate, or there might be two shown in this generic example below, or there might be more. In the course of a chemical reaction, which we illustrate with an arrow, a very specific enzyme binds to the substrates, joins atoms together or breaks atoms apart, manipulates the bonds, in other words, to produce a different molecule or molecules that we call products. The final molecules of a chemical reaction are always referred to as the products. Here is another example of a chemical reaction. It's one reaction that's illustrated in two different ways. We can see the structural formulas of our reactants, and then below the molecular formulas. So we have two hydrogen molecules. Each of these circles here represents a hydrogen atom, and you can see there's a covalent bond holding them together in each of the molecules. Oxygen, just two oxygen atoms, is a molecule held together with two covalent bonds between two oxygen atoms. In the course of the chemical reaction, bonds are broken, new bonds are formed, and the result is products that include two molecules of water, H2O. In a living system, in a cell, enzymes are responsible for chemical reactions. Enzymes, which are usually proteins, are the biological catalysts that facilitate chemical reactions in an organism. Enzymes may create bonds, joining atoms together, or they may break bonds pulling atoms apart. It just depends on the type of chemical reaction you are studying. Regardless, in order to perform a chemical reaction, the substrates, the starting molecules, must have a specific three-dimensional shape that is complementary to a region on the enzyme surface called the active site. The active site binds to the substrate with, again, that hand-in-glove complementarity, and then the chemical reaction can proceed. Therefore, every enzyme has a very specific substrate or substrates to which it can interact, and only performs that chemical reaction. This concludes your Chapter 2 material. This slide lists a few of the learning objectives. Please be sure that you can answer all of these and the learning objectives that are posted online for your class as well.